Are you one of the millions of people that feel drawn to horses? Is this the year you're finally going to make the leap and buy a horse of your own? People are captivated by horses for many reasons. Horses offer a unique emotional connection that I think folks are craving more and more as our society turns to a fast-paced and digital way of life. A horse's beauty and strength are inspiring, and the sense of freedom you feel as you ride into the mountains or gallop across an open pasture is something that cannot be explained, it can only be felt. Real quick, you might be saying to yourself, why does this guy keep saying horses, but he's showing video of mules? Well, here on our little homestead, we have 4 mules and 1 horse. We love all of them, and we treat them all just the same. In this video, I not only want to share exactly what each of our equines cost, but I also want to share some updated prices that are associated with horses, but not included in the purchase price. We'll talk about feed costs, vet and hoof care, boarding costs, vehicle and trailer maintenance, and at the end, I want to share a little about one of the most important and often overlooked items to have before buying a horse, and why it's made horse ownership much more enjoyable for me and Alyssa. And finally, I want to share our top 3 tips for minimizing the cost of horse ownership. Because if you truly feel like you want to own a horse, then Alyssa and I want to help make that a possibility. Now let's dive into exactly how much we paid for each of our 5 equines and what exactly we got for that purchase price. Clyde was our first purchase, and he cost $5,500. He was 3 years old, he was broke to ride, and he had packed meat in the mountains. He was far from a finished mountain mule, but he was at a point you could saddle him and ride him right away. Do it again. Next, we got Riata, and she cost $2,300. While Riata is absolutely stunning, she did come to us with a lot of fear of humans.
Sweetheart, you're doing
good. She'd been ridden and packed a little bit, but she was really lacking trust. She has become a reliable mountain mule, and her sweet personality is showing through, but 3 years later, and we're still working on the quirks that she has because of her fear of people. Next up, we have Cedar. Cedar cost $1,000, and she was 4 years old when we bought her. Cedar came from a loving home, but she had a bad experience with a saddle rolling under her belly, and she really had a bucking problem. She was pretty fearful and explosive when we got her, but she's really coming along well, and we trust her more and more with each passing month. One thing that's really interesting to note is how quickly a mule or horse can overcome the fear of an object, like a saddle in Cedar's experience, versus when they develop a justified fear of people, it takes a lot longer for them to overcome it, like in Riata's situation. But it really is super rewarding to see how much a mule or a horse can learn to trust you if you put in consistent time and effort and really show them that you care about them. You're not just forcing them into things. Next up, we have the flashiest mule in the West, my wife's one true love, and that's Josie, the polka-dotted princess. Because of her flashy color, Josie was originally listed for $10,000 as a weanling. And Alyssa fell in love with her, but we chose not to buy her at that price. Her listing was removed and Alyssa was heartbroken. But 6 months later, Josie came back up for sale for $5,000 and we made the leap and bought her. She was basically untouched at that time, but we knew she would have good size because her mama was a stout 15-1 Appaloosa and her daddy was a 14-3 spotted jack with big bone. We've had her for about 9 months and she's already packing a saddle in the mountains for us. And our next equine is the oddball of the group, our one and only short ear, Mesa. Mesa costs $2,000 and she's a draft cross filly. Her mama's 3/4 quarter horse and 1/4 Percheron, and her daddy is full-blood Percheron. She'd been haltered and handled just a little bit when we picked her up, but she basically has no training. She's just now turning 9 months old, so we won't be able to ride her for a couple years, but she's came from a long line of big, strong, stout outfitting horses in western Wyoming. She's friendly and playful, she has a great head on her shoulders, and she's going to be a big, stout mountain mare. Now, before I dive into some of the hidden costs of buying a horse or a mule, I do want to take a minute to say that only you can decide if you're financially ready to buy a horse or a mule. Just have an honest conversation with yourself about your priorities, your goals, and your specific financial circumstances. And then, just make the best decision you can with the information you have. Alyssa and I decided to pay off all of our debt before buying our first mule. That being said, we weren't willing to wait a decade to buy an equine because we knew that they would truly enrich our lives. So we decided to build our herd before we were able to buy our forever home. We live in a double wide on 2.5 acres, and we know that our horse and mules are slowing down the process of us getting into our dream home on a big acreage, but that's okay. They bring us a ton of happiness, and we'll gladly live here in our ugly house with our awesome little herd versus living in town and saving up a bunch of money more quickly. All right, let's dive into some of the post-horse purchase costs of horse ownership. The biggest annual costs associated with equine ownership are vehicle and trailer maintenance, hoof and vet care, feed costs, and the often overlooked costs of tack and supplies. Now, if you're thoughtful and thrifty, you can minimize these costs, but they do still add up, so there's something to consider before you make the leap into horse ownership. Now, Alyssa and I don't personally feel comfortable owning a horse or a mule without having a way to haul them, so let's first dive into the costs of a truck and a trailer. Now, this one can vary greatly. For sake of example though, our setup is a 2007 Duramax and a 20-year-old horse trailer. Truck and trailer setups can range greatly from the $10,000 range for old junkers to $250,000 for a living quarters trailer and a new diesel pickup, which is mind-blowing. If you're only hauling 1 or 2 horses, you're sticking close to home, and you don't have a big ego, you could probably find something safe and reliable for around $15,000. Our truck cost us $18,000 in 2019, and our trailer cost $10,000. They're safe and reliable-ish, but they're certainly nothing fancy to look at. We have our trailer serviced once a year for about $150, and our fuel and oil costs for our truck are pretty high, but that's because we travel with our herd a lot. If you just ride close to home, you could probably count on fuel, oil, and tire costs averaging in the $1,000 to $2,000 range per year. Now on to hoof and vet care. Our hoof and vet care, including health certifications, vaccinations, worming, teeth floating, and hoof trims, averages around $700 per year per equine. Again, this can vary a lot depending on your location and your skill set. You can save a lot of money by learning how to trim and shoe your own equines. Now let's talk about the cost that probably varies the most greatly depending on your location, and that is the cost of feed. We pay just under $1,000 per year per horse for hay. Our herd goes out on supplemental pasture for 4 months every year, and we try to err on the side of keeping them overfed versus underfed. Honestly, if you're feeding good hay to a healthy horse, you probably don't need supplemental grain, but we do choose to feed our youngsters Purina Ultium grain, which costs an additional $40 per month. Now let's jump into the cost of tack. If you're just now buying your first horse, it's likely that you don't have a full tack setup yet. So let's talk about the essentials. We'll start from the ground up. You'll need a hoof pick for $5, a curry comb, roughly $10, a brush, also roughly $10, a saddle pad from $50 to $200, a saddle, you could probably find one for around $1,000 used, I bet, a head stall bit and reins, which will be about $200-ish, and a good halter, which will be about 40 bucks. We like double diamond rope halters the best. With a little bit of searching, you should be able to find everything you need to get started for less than $1,500. One thing to remember is that you don't need to buy a real fancy saddle, but it might be worth saving up a little bit more up front to buy a saddle that is high quality and that fits your equine right off the bat, so you don't end up just having to buy one a little later down the line. Also, depending on where you live, there may be some local tax sales where you can find great bargains on good used gear. Now, before I get into the top 3 ways to minimize the cost of horse ownership, I do want to get into one of the costs that can bring a horse owner the most peace. And that is the cost of having an emergency fund set aside specifically for your equines. Now, this can be a bank account or an envelope in your sock drawer, whatever you feel comfortable with, but it'll cover unforeseen expenses. We like to have enough for a colic surgery set aside, but even just a few $100 set aside for emergencies can really help. There's nothing worse than looking into your pasture and seeing your animal cut up or not feeling well, but having money to pay for whatever treatment they need can at least mitigate the financial side of that tough experience. All right, you're probably thinking that owning a horse sounds pretty dang expensive, and it is. But before you get discouraged, let's jump into the top 3 ways that you can save money while owning a horse or a mule. Let's jump right into number 3, and this is the best way to minimize the upfront cost of buying a horse or a mule, and that would be to buy a horse that is either young, old, or has minimal training. A middle-aged, well-trained horse will be the most expensive horse you can buy. So if you're confident in your training ability, try and buy a horse that hasn't been worked with a bunch, and put in the time and effort it takes to turn them into a good saddle animal. That being said, a cheap horse can be a really challenging horse. So don't get in over your head. If you're not confident in your training ability, we would definitely recommend saving up a little more money to get an animal that you can just enjoy because they're already well trained. Now, another good way to minimize that upfront cost of owning a horse would be to buy a real plain looking horse. It doesn't matter, like once you've had a horse for a while, you've worked with them, you've built a relationship with them, that horse is going to bring you just as much happiness if it's just a plain brown horse as if it's the flashiest horse in the world. Now let's move on to the number 2 way to save money. This is the best way to minimize the monthly cost of horse ownership, and that is utilize the property you already have. If you already have a little piece of land, build your own corral and shelters, and this will save you the monthly cost of boarding a horse. But if you don't have land, that's all right. You may be able to find a place to board your horse where you can help with chores and projects around the barn in exchange for discounted or even free rates. When I had my first horse, I was living in Lewiston, Idaho, and there was a super nice older couple that owned the boarding facility where I kept my horse, and they actually wanted to go on a vacation. So in exchange for me watching all their animals when they went on that vacation, they gave me a couple free months off of my board. It was super nice because I was broke and they hadn't been on a vacation in years, so it was really a win-win. All right, let's jump into the number 1 way to save money while owning a horse. This is the best way to minimize the annual cost of horse ownership, and that is find someone who needs help during haying season. The cost of hay is our biggest yearly expense. The health of our herd is our number 1 priority, and cheap hay is not something we want to mess with. That being said, if you want premium hay at a less than premium price, you may be able to help a farmer put up hay in the summertime in exchange for discounted or even free hay, depending on how much you help them out. Owning a horse or a mule can be overwhelming and expensive, but it can also be one of the most rewarding and enriching experiences of your life. Our hope is that this video can at least paint a rough picture of how much a horse will cost, not only in upfront price, but also in annual expenses over the course of the year. If you want to see the benefits of horse ownership, make sure you click subscribe. We have a ton of fun with our little herd, and this channel is all about living our life in the mountains with our animals.